A golden retriever is lying on a kitchen floor in the late afternoon light, working through a bowl of kibble one mouthful at a time, and if you could pull back her lips and count what is actually sitting in that jaw, you would find 42 teeth arranged in almost the exact pattern of a wolf's. Not a similar pattern, not a softened, domesticated approximation. The same count, the same order, and tucked into the upper and lower jaw on each side. The same pair of blades that a wolf uses to shear through hide and muscle and tendon in a single closing bite. That dog has not tasted raw hide or muscle or tendon in her entire life. She has tasted chicken meal, rice, and beet pulp, extruded into a beige pellet and bagged at a factory hundreds of miles from where she is now lying on the tile. The bowl gets refilled twice a day, on schedule, without her ever having to chase, kill, or fight another animal for a single bite of it. But her mouth was built for something else entirely, a mouth designed for a world where every meal had to be taken by force from something that did not want to give it up, and nobody ever got around to changing it. That gap is the entire story here, and it is stranger than it sounds. Dogs split off from an ancient wolf population somewhere between roughly 40,000 and 15,000 years ago, depending on which genetic study you trust, and in the years since, humans have reshaped nearly everything about them. We have shrunk them down to teacup size and blown them up past the size of a small wolf pack. We have flattened their faces, curled their tails, dropped their ears, and rewired their brains to read human faces the way no wild canid ever has. Domestication is usually described as a wholesale transformation. Wolf in, dog out, and for most of the body, that description holds up. But teeth are the part of the story that domestication seems to have mostly skipped, and once you understand why, it changes how you think about what is actually happening every time your dog crunches down on dinner. You do not have to go back to the very origin of dogs to see how old this wolf-like jaw already is. The oldest widely accepted domestic dog burial in the archaeological record sits in Bonn-Oberkassel, Germany, where quarry workers uncovered a grave in 1914 holding 2 adult humans and the bones of a young dog, later dated to roughly 14,200 years old. A re-examination led by Luc Janssens at Ghent University, published in 2018 in the Journal of Archaeological Science, confirmed the animal was a genuine domestic dog rather than a wolf, distinguishable through its skeleton despite dying at only around 7 months old. That dog's teeth already carried the dental signature researchers used to separate early dogs from wolves in the first place, yet 14,000 years later, the underlying blueprint, the tooth count, the carnassial shear, the basic architecture, has barely moved. Interestingly, the Bonn-Oberkassel dog also shows some of the oldest documented periodontal disease in a domestic dog, though Janssens and his colleagues tie that specific case to a severe, prolonged bout of canine distemper that likely compromised the animal's immune system as a puppy, not to anything resembling a modern diet. It is a reminder that periodontal disease itself is nothing new. What is new is how common it has become, and why. Start with the wolf, because the wolf is the baseline everything else gets measured against. A wolf's skull is built around a single functional demand, which is killing large animals, therefore processing the carcass fast enough to get a meal before a rival pack or a scavenger shows up. Long jaws generate more bite force at the back of the mouth. A deep, muscular attachment across the top of the skull anchors jaw muscles, capable of cracking open the leg bones of an elk. And in the middle of that arsenal sit the carnassials, the fourth upper premolar and first lower molar on each side, which do not meet flat against each other the way grinding molars do. They pass each other at an angle, blade against blade, like a pair of scissors built out of bone and enamel. A wolf that has just made a kill can eat as much as 20 pounds of meat in a single sitting, gorging fast before a rival pack, a bear, or a scavenging flock of ravens moves in, and that pace of consumption is only possible because the carnassial shear can strip a carcass down to usable pieces almost as fast as the wolf can swallow them. A wolf uses that shear to slice through raw hide and strip muscle from bone in seconds. It is not a general-purpose tool. It is a piece of surgical equipment for a carnivore that needs to process a kill before anything about that kill is manageable in smaller bites. Now look at a dog's skull, and here is where the surprise starts. Whatever breed you pick, whatever size, a domestic dog still carries that same carnassial pair, still sheared to a blade edge, still hinged to pass past each other exactly the way a wolf's do. The dental formula is identical. 3 incisors, 1 canine, 4 premolars, and 2 molars on the upper jaw per side. 3 incisors, 1 canine, 4 premolars, and 3 molars on the lower jaw per side, adding up to 42 teeth total, and that count has not budged across roughly 15 to 40,000 years of domestication. A Chihuahua and a wolf are separated by an almost absurd difference in body size, skull shape, and temperament, but count their teeth and you get the same number, arranged the same way, doing, at least in theory, the same job. This is where a video like this usually just says teeth did not change and moves on, but that framing hides the more interesting question, which is why. Because domestication was not shy about touching the rest of the skull. Snouts shortened. Jaws became more crowded in some breeds. Skull proportions shifted enough that a Rottweiler skull and a wolf skull are distinguishable at a glance by anyone who works in a zooarchaeology lab. If domestication was willing to reshape the architecture the teeth sit inside of, why would it leave the teeth themselves so thoroughly alone? Part of the answer is that people assumed for decades that it did not leave them alone. Tooth crowding, where teeth in the lower jaw get squeezed together as the snout shortens faster than the tooth row inside it, has been used since the early 20th century as one of the standard markers archaeologists look for when they are trying to decide whether an ancient canid skeleton belonged to a wolf or an early dog. The logic seemed clean. Domestication shortens the jaw. A shorter jaw has less room for the same number of teeth. Crowded teeth, therefore, should mean domesticated dog. But Carly Amin and colleagues at the University of Liverpool ran the actual numbers in 2017, publishing in the Journal of Archaeological Science, and what they found undercuts the assumption almost completely, working from a large comparative sample, 750 modern dogs and 205 modern wolves, along with more than 60 late Pleistocene wolves from Alaska. They measured crowding using a standardized landmark-based method rather than eyeballing it the way earlier researchers had. Modern dogs in their sample showed crowding in roughly 6% of specimens. Modern wolves showed it in about 18%. Ancient wolves showed it in about 36%. In other words, the animals everyone had been using as the uncrowded baseline, wild wolves, were crowded far more often than the domestic dogs they were supposedly being contrasted against. The pattern researchers had built decades of interpretation on turned out to run in the opposite direction from what everyone assumed, and Amin's team concluded that tooth crowding should be dropped as a reliable marker of early domestication until someone figures out what is actually driving it, because right now, it clearly is not simply domestication doing what everyone thought it was doing. It is worth pausing on one honest complication here, because the mouth is not a perfect wolf mouth in every respect, just in tooth count, shape, and position. Comparative anatomy research on bite mechanics has found that dog canines average shorter than a wolf's, typically in the range of about 1.5 to 3 inches, compared to the wolf's longer, more dagger-like canine, and a wolf's overall bite force, driven by a heavier skull and a larger, more densely packed jaw muscle mass, generally outstrips a similarly sized dog's. So the blades are the same shape and the same number, but the engine swinging them is not identical, and that matters for anyone tempted to assume a dog's mouth can safely do everything a wolf's can. The tools are inherited. The horsepower behind them was not preserved quite as faithfully. That finding matters here for a specific reason. If tooth crowding, the one dental trait people thought had shifted under domestication, turns out to be noisy and possibly backwards, then the far more basic traits, tooth number, tooth shape, and the order in which teeth erupt, look even more untouched by comparison. And that is exactly what a separate line of research found when scientists went looking directly at dental development itself rather than just crowding. Madeleine Geiger and colleagues at the University of Zurich published a study in 2016 in the journal Zoological Letters, built on radiographs and skeletal remains from 137 domestic dogs across 15 breeds and 64 wolves. What they were testing was whether domestication had reshuffled the order in which a dog's body reaches maturity, since one older hypothesis held that dogs, as a neotenized, juvenilized version of a wolf, might show teeth, skeleton, and sexual maturity arriving in a scrambled sequence compared to their wild ancestor. Instead, Geiger's team found that domestic dogs go through dental and skeletal maturation in essentially the same sequence as wolves. The timing shifted. Dogs reach some milestones earlier or later in absolute terms than wolves do, but the order those milestones happen in, including exactly when each tooth erupts relative to the others, stayed wolf-like. The conclusion of the paper was almost blunt about it. Domestic dogs, dentally speaking, are more wolf than anyone had given them credit for. So the shape held. The count held. Even the developmental schedule held. Which raises the obvious question again, sharper this time. If nothing about a dog's diet resembles a wolf's diet, why would evolution leave the one part of the body most directly responsible for processing food almost completely alone? Here is where the story flips, because it turns out something in a dog's body did change fast and dramatically in response to diet. It just was not the teeth. It was the plumbing behind them. In 2013, a team led by Erik Axelsson at Uppsala University in Sweden published a genome comparison between dogs and wolves in the journal Nature, sequencing enough DNA from both to hunt for regions that showed clear fingerprints of selection during domestication. They found 36 candidate regions. Just over half were tied to brain function and nervous system development, which fits the well-known story of dogs becoming calmer, more socially attuned animals than wolves. But 10 of those regions were tied to something else entirely: starch digestion and fat metabolism, and the standout among them was a gene called AMY2B, which codes for pancreatic amylase, the enzyme that breaks starch down into sugar the body can actually use. Wolves carry very few copies of this gene because raw meat contains almost no starch, so there was never anything for extra amylase to do. Dogs, by contrast, carry many more copies. Axelsson's team found an average roughly 7-fold increase in AMY2B copy number in dogs compared to wolves, and follow-up studies have since found individual dogs carrying anywhere from about 2 to 20 diploid copies, depending on breed and ancestry, with breeds historically raised on grain-heavy, agricultural diets tending to carry more, and breeds like Siberian Huskies and Alaskan Malamutes, descended from populations that stayed closer to a hunting or fishing diet, tending to. A 2016 paleogenetic study published in Royal Society Open Science pushed the timeline further back, testing ancient dog remains from Europe, and finding evidence that this amylase expansion was already underway by around 7,000 years ago, tracking almost exactly with the spread of early farming and the grain surplus that came with it. Give a population of scavenging proto-dogs a steady supply of human agricultural waste, and within a few thousand years, evolution rewired their digestive chemistry to extract more calories from it. That is fast, and it is the opposite of what happened to their teeth. Dogs are not even unique among domesticated carnivores in showing this exact split between a fast digestive rewrite and a frozen mouth. Cats, domesticated far more recently and far less intensively than dogs, still carry an essentially wild feline dental setup, dominated by shearing carnassials with almost no flat grinding surface at all, because cats never went through the same long cohabitation with human agriculture that put sustained pressure on canine starch metabolism. A house cat crunching dry kibble is arguably an even more extreme version of this mismatch than a dog is, chewing with a mouth that has close to zero capacity to grind plant material, built entirely around slicing meat off small prey. Dogs, by contrast, at least evolved the metabolic machinery to make use of a grain-heavy diet, even though the teeth in front of that machinery never got the memo. Comparing the two is a useful reminder that this is not a story about one unlucky species. It is a structural feature of how domestication tends to work on carnivores generally, changing behavior and biochemistry quickly while leaving the ancient, deeply conserved architecture of the mouth mostly where evolution left it thousands, or, in a wolf's case, millions of years earlier. This is the actual shape of the mismatch, and it is worth sitting with for a second, because it is not intuitive. Most people who think about dog evolution at all assume that a dog eating kibble instead of meat must have teeth adapted for grinding rather than shearing, the same way a cow's flat molars are adapted for grinding grass rather than tearing flesh. That assumption is wrong. Dogs did adapt to a starch-heavy diet, but the adaptation happened almost entirely downstream of the mouth, in the pancreas and the small intestine, in enzymes and transport proteins, not in enamel and bone. The teeth stayed built for a carnivore. The digestive tract behind them quietly became something closer to an omnivore's. A dog chewing kibble is running a fast, efficient, recently evolved starch processing system that starts well after the point where the food has already passed a set of blades engineered millennia ago to shear muscle off a leg bone, blades that a piece of dry kibble simply does not require and mostly does not get. There is a reason the mouth lagged so far behind the gut, and it comes down to how differently these two systems are built, biologically speaking. A lot of what people call domestication syndrome, the shortened snout, the floppy ears, the curled tail, the patches of unpigmented fur, the delayed onset of fear responses, traces back to changes in a specific population of embryonic cells called neural crest cells, which migrate around the developing body early in gestation and influence an unusually wide range of structures at once, including parts of the skull, the cartilage in the ears, pigment cells in the skin, and stress hormone regulation. Researchers studying the famous Soviet farm fox experiment, in which Dmitry Belyaev's team selectively bred foxes purely for tameness, starting in 1959 at the Institute of Cytology and Genetics in Novosibirsk, found that after only a few generations of selecting for one trait, calm behavior around humans, a cluster of unrelated physical traits started showing up as a side effect: floppy ears, curled tails, patchy coats. In 2014, evolutionary biologist Adam Wilkins, primatologist Richard Wrangham of Harvard University, and cognitive biologist Tecumseh Fitch of the University of Vienna proposed a unifying explanation for that pattern in the journal Genetics, arguing that many domestication traits cluster together because they all trace back to mild, partial deficits in how neural crest cells migrate and differentiate during early embryonic development. Ears, tail carriage, coat pigmentation, jaw size, and stress hormone regulation are all shaped, to varying degrees, by that same population of cells, so selecting hard for tameness alone can drag a whole bundle of unrelated-looking traits along for the ride as a side effect. It is a compelling idea, and an influential one, though not an uncontested one. More recent papers, including one in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, have argued the evidence better fits shared disruption to reproductive hormone timing rather than neural crest cells specifically, and the debate over exactly which developmental mechanism drives domestication syndrome is still active among biologists. What researchers on both sides of that debate agree on, however, is that whatever process is responsible, it does not appear to route heavily through the genetic programs that build teeth. Teeth are not wired into that bundle the same way, or at least not nearly as tightly. Tooth development runs on its own ancient, deeply conserved genetic program, a cascade of signaling genes that has been shaping vertebrate teeth for hundreds of millions of years, and tends to be comparatively insulated from the kind of rapid, correlated shifts that swept through a dog's ears, tail, and coat. Changing tooth number, tooth shape, or the timing of tooth eruption generally requires more direct, more specific selective pressure aimed at the teeth themselves, not just a side effect of selecting for something else. And there was never much pressure aimed at the teeth themselves, because humans were not selecting dogs for their bite. Early domestication selected, above almost everything else, for tolerance of people and proximity to human settlements. The dogs that thrived near early villages were the ones calm enough to scavenge trash piles without triggering a spear, not the ones with slightly blunter molars. Later, once dogs became working animals, humans selected for herding instinct, guarding instinct, scent tracking, size, coat, and eventually, in the last couple of centuries, for almost pure aesthetics. At no point in that long chain of selection did anyone need a dog with different teeth, so the teeth simply rode along unchanged, a fully intact predator's toolkit inherited wholesale from an ancestor whose lifestyle no longer applies. And this is where the story stops being a piece of interesting trivia about evolutionary biology and starts becoming something that shows up in a veterinarian's exam room. Because a set of blades built for shearing raw hide does not get meaningfully engaged by a dry, brittle pellet that shatters under a fraction of the force a wolf routinely applies to bone and muscle. Watch a dog eat kibble closely, and you will notice most pieces get one or two quick crushes before being swallowed, not the sustained shearing action the carnassial teeth were built to perform. The mechanical relationship between tool and task has essentially collapsed. The tool is still there, sharp, correctly positioned, fully wired into the jaw exactly as it would be in a wild wolf, but the task it was designed for almost never happens anymore. There is a popular belief that this does not matter much, because dry kibble supposedly cleans a dog's teeth as it crunches, scraping away plaque the way a chew toy might. The Merck Veterinary Manual addresses this directly, noting that the common assumption that dry food reduces plaque and tartar buildup through mechanical cleaning does not necessarily hold up in practice, and the numbers back that skepticism up. Cornell University's College of Veterinary Medicine states plainly that studies show 80 to 90% of dogs over the age of 3 have some degree of periodontal disease, even in dogs whose teeth look clean and white on the surface, because the real damage tends to happen below the gum line, out of sight, driven by plaque bacteria rather than visible buildup on the crown of the tooth. The American Veterinary Medical Association reports similar numbers, with signs of periodontal disease showing up in most dogs and cats by around age 3. Broader survey-based studies across different countries put general prevalence estimates anywhere from roughly 44 to over 80%, depending on the population sampled and how disease was measured. And separate research on dogs housed in commercial breeding facilities in Indiana and Illinois found periodontal disease of some grade in more than 86% of adult dogs examined. However you slice the numbers, periodontal disease sits near the very top of the list of health problems veterinarians actually see, and it is overwhelmingly a modern problem, not an ancient one, because a wolf tearing into a fresh kill and gnawing through raw bone on a semi-regular basis is putting its dentition through exactly the kind of resistance and cleaning action that its teeth evolved to expect. A dog eating twice a day from a bowl of soft pellets is not. The pattern is not evenly spread across all dogs either, which is its own clue about what is really going on. A large-scale study cited by Veterinary Trade Press found overall periodontal disease prevalence of just over 50% across a broad dog population, with a mean age of nearly 11 years among affected animals compared to under 8 years among unaffected ones, and toy and small breeds, including the American Cocker Spaniel, Papillon, and Yorkshire Terrier, showing up repeatedly as higher risk categories. Smaller mouths mean the same 42 teeth get packed into less jaw, which tracks with everything already covered here about crowding, mechanical stress, and how much room a tooth actually has to sit in before its neighbors start crowding it toward disease. This naturally raises the question of what, if anything, a dog owner is supposed to do with all of this, and it is worth being fair to more than one side of that conversation, because it is genuinely contested. One camp, generally aligned with mainstream veterinary nutrition, points out that modern commercial diets, dry or wet, are formulated to be nutritionally complete, and that periodontal disease is managed far more reliably through professional dental cleanings, at-home brushing, and veterinary-approved dental chews than through any change in kibble shape or size. Another camp, often associated with raw or ancestral-style feeding, argues that regular access to raw, meaty bones under supervision more closely recreates the mechanical resistance a wolf's teeth evolved to expect, and points to lower calculus buildup in some raw-fed populations as support. The honest complication cuts against a simple answer either way. Raw or cooked bones also carry real risks of tooth fracture and gastrointestinal injury that veterinary dentists see regularly. Cooked bones far more so than raw ones, since cooking makes bone brittle in a way it is not in its natural state, and not every dog, especially small or elderly dogs, can safely manage that mechanical demand at all. What both camps are really circling, whether they frame it as a feeding philosophy or a dental health strategy, is the same underlying mismatch this video has been building toward: a mouth built for resistance now living mostly without it. None of this means kibble is some kind of dietary catastrophe, and it is worth being careful here, because the honest scientific picture is more nuanced than a simple villain narrative. Wet food, in fact, tends to be associated with somewhat lower rates of periodontal disease risk in some studies than dry food, which runs directly against the folk wisdom that crunchy equals clean. Body size matters too, with several large studies finding that bigger dogs tend to have lower rates of periodontal disease than small and toy breeds, likely tied to differences in jaw proportion, tooth crowding within the jaw, and how much force different-sized dogs are physically capable of applying when they do chew. What the research supports is something narrower and, honestly, stranger than a simple diet warning. It is that a dog's mouth is running equipment calibrated for a job that essentially stopped existing the moment humans started filling a bowl twice a day. And the gap between what those teeth were built to do and what they actually get asked to do shows up, statistically, as one of the most common diagnoses in veterinary medicine. There is a behavioral echo of all this too, one you have probably watched happen in your own living room without connecting it to any of this. Dogs gnaw. Constantly. Compulsively. On rawhide. On antlers. On the corner of a couch cushion if nothing better is available. Often while a full bowl of kibble sits untouched a few feet away. That drive to chew is not really about hunger or nutrition. It is closer to a piece of inherited behavioral software, left running long after the hardware it was written for stopped mattering in quite the same way. An echo of a wolf's need to work a carcass down, strip connective tissue, and crack open bone for marrow, expressed now as a Labrador methodically destroying a tennis ball on a living room rug. The teeth are still shaped for that job. Part of the brain still seems to expect it too. Veterinary behaviorists generally treat this chewing drive as a genuine welfare need, rather than a quirky habit, which is why appropriate chew items are so often recommended as a form of behavioral enrichment for dogs kept in fairly sedentary, low-stimulation households. A dog denied any legitimate outlet for that drive frequently redirects it toward furniture, shoes, or drywall, not out of spite, but because the underlying motivation to gnaw, mouth, and work an object between the carnassials does not simply switch off just because the animal is well fed. Watch closely, and the behavior even mimics the original function in miniature. A dog will often brace a chew toy between its front paws, angle its head to one side, and work a specific tooth against it with focused, repeated pressure, the exact posture a wolf uses to strip meat from a bone, minus the meat, minus the bone, minus any nutritional payoff at all. It is muscle memory for a task that technically ended for that individual animal the moment a bowl of kibble became a reliable, twice-daily guarantee. That is the paradox in miniature. The stomach stopped needing the old behavior generations ago. Nobody told the jaw. There is an uncomfortable little mirror in this for us too, if you are willing to look at it. Human amylase genes went through a strikingly similar expansion. George Perry and colleagues, in a 2007 study published in Nature Genetics, found that people from societies with a long history of starch-heavy agriculture tend to carry more copies of the human salivary amylase gene, AMY1, than people from populations with a longer history of low-starch, high-protein diets, and that higher copy numbers correspond to more salivary amylase protein and more efficient starch digestion. We underwent our own version of exactly what happened inside a dog's pancreas, a fast, targeted, diet-driven genetic edit layered on top of a body that in most other respects still carries the anatomy of a Pleistocene hunter-gatherer, including, depending on which researcher you ask, a set of molars and jaw proportions arguably better suited to tougher, less processed food than most of us eat today. We did not redesign ourselves for the world we built. We patched selected systems and left the rest running on inherited defaults, the same uneven, piecemeal editing process this video has been describing in a dog's mouth, just running quietly in the mirror as well. Put all of it together and the picture that emerges is not really about dogs being poorly designed, or about domestication failing at its job. It is about domestication never having been a single coordinated redesign in the first place. It is closer to an editing process spread out over thousands of years, with different editors working on different chapters at wildly different speeds and almost no communication between them. The chapter on temperament got rewritten fast and completely, because that was the trait humans were selecting for from the very beginning. The chapter on digestion got rewritten fast too, once dogs started living off human agricultural leftovers, because a gene like AMY2B could expand its copy number in a genetically flexible population within a few thousand years, especially once farming created a steady, calorie-rich, starch-heavy food source worth adapting to. But the chapter on teeth barely got touched, because nothing about early domestication ever put direct pressure on the mouth, and because tooth development runs on some of the most conserved, most change-resistant genetic scaffolding an animal carries. So picture that golden retriever on the kitchen floor again, working her way through the bowl. Somewhere in that unhurried, familiar scene sits a genuinely strange fact that she is chewing modern, mass-produced, starch-heavy food with a mouth that a Pleistocene wolf would recognize immediately, tooth for tooth, blade for blade, arranged in an order that has not meaningfully shifted since long before agriculture, before villages, before anyone thought to breed an animal for its temperament rather than its bite. Her stomach and pancreas have moved on. Her jaw never got the memo. And every time she finishes a bowl and picks up a chew toy anyway, gnawing at it with far more focus than the moment requires, she is running a few million years of carnivore hardware through a job that mostly does not need it anymore. One crunch at a time. None of that makes her any less of a dog, and none of it means anything is wrong with her, specifically. It just means the animal curled up on your kitchen floor is not a finished product. She is a draft, mid-revision, carrying forward whatever the last editor happened to skip. Wolves are still out there today, still running the original manuscript, still shearing hide with the same blades. Dogs are the edited copy, rewritten fast in the chapters that mattered most for living alongside people, and left almost untouched in the one chapter nobody thought to open. If you want more of these deep dives into the strange leftover pieces animals carry around from lives they no longer live, subscribe, because there is a lot more of this kind of mismatch hiding in plain sight than most people realize.